How did your parents handle it when your sibling died? My dad showed up 6 months after my brother's funeral and said the most insane thing I'd ever heard. You need to legally change your name to Robert Jr., because I still deserve to have a son with my name. I thought grief had broken his brain, until Mom stood behind him nodding. Dad, you can't just give me my dead brother's name, I said. I'm Robert Sr. and need a son who's a Robert Jr. Either you go to the courthouse tomorrow, or you're not my son at all. 3 days later, he hired an actual lawyer to send me a formal cease and desist letter, demanding I stop using the name Josh because it was causing him emotional distress to not have a Robert Jr. in the family. He'd gathered 17 family members for an intervention, where he presented a slideshow about the importance of legacy and generational names, complete with genealogy charts showing every Robert in our family tree for 6 generations. The lawyer he'd brought stood up halfway through and said he couldn't be part of this insanity, but my dad kept going. My uncle tried to explain that you can't force someone to take a dead person's name, but my dad started screaming that I was stealing his right to have a namesake. I ended up just walking out and now showing up to his scheduled court date. And given that I didn't hear another peep, I thought that was that. Until 4 months later, he showed up at my job with a court order he'd forged claiming I'd legally changed my name to Robert Jr. He told my entire office to start calling me by my dead brother's name. He already had business cards with Robert Jr. on them and replaced my nameplate while I was at lunch, then sent emails from a spoofed address announcing my name change to all our clients. When security escorted him out, he stood in the parking lot with a megaphone announcing that Josh was dead and Robert Jr. had replaced him, holding a funeral wreath with my picture in it while wearing a suit covered in photos of my brother. When everybody in my life still referred to me as Josh, he completely lost his mind. He tried to actually become his own junior by legally changing his age to make himself young enough to be his own son. He went to Mexico and got black market hormone treatments to reverse his aging, injecting himself with experimental stem cells and testosterone blockers to make himself younger so he could legally argue he was Robert Jr. instead of Robert Sr. He had his teeth pulled out and replaced with younger implants, got hair transplants from a 20-year-old donor, and even tried to get a bone marrow transplant from a teenager to reset his DNA age. He was taking 40 pills a day and getting weekly blood transfusions from college kids he paid, and he actually filed paperwork with the court claiming he'd reversed his biological age by 30 years so he could be both Robert Sr. and Robert Jr. simultaneously. His body started rejecting everything at once, and he ended up in the ICU with multiple organ failure because he'd poisoned himself trying to become young enough to be his own son, and the doctors said he'd permanently destroyed his liver and kidneys trying to change his biological age markers. When I visited him in the hospital where he was waiting for the organ donor list, he grabbed my hand with his destroyed body shaking from all the damage he'd done. You forced me to try to become my own junior because you wouldn't take the name, he said while machines kept him alive. I'm dying because you couldn't just honor your brother and become Robert Jr. like I asked. You literally tried to age yourself backward, I said, but my mom slapped me and said her husband was dying because of my selfishness. If you had just changed your name, I wouldn't be on dialysis waiting for organs that might never come, he wheezed, and my entire family stood around his bed nodding like this made perfect sense. I kept my name Josh, but lost everything else when my family started a campaign saying I'd murdered my father by refusing to take my dead brother's name. They posted photos of him hooked to machines next to photos of my brother's funeral, saying I'd killed them both by refusing one simple request. The GoFundMe for his medical bills explicitly said he was dying because his selfish son wouldn't honor family legacy, and it had raised $200,000 from strangers who called me a monster in the comments. My job let me go because clients were uncomfortable working with someone who'd driven their father to organ failure, and even my landlord suggested I move because neighbors were asking questions. My mom served me with power of attorney paperwork that would let her legally change my name while I slept, and she'd already forged my signature on half the forms. The pounding on my door at 3 in the morning woke me from the first real sleep I'd had in weeks. 2 police officers stood in my hallway asking if I was Josh and requesting to see identification. I grabbed my wallet and birth certificate from the filing cabinet while they explained someone had filed documents claiming I'd legally changed my name to Robert Jr. The female officer examined my driver's license under her flashlight while her partner checked the birth certificate against some paperwork they'd brought. They asked if my mother had recently tried to file any legal documents on my behalf. I showed them the power of attorney forms she'd left and pointed out where she'd already forged my signature on half the pages. The officers exchanged looks, and the male one explained someone had called in a welfare check claiming I was having a mental breakdown and pretending to be someone named Josh when I was really Robert Jr. I pulled out the folder where I'd been keeping all the restraining order paperwork I'd started preparing, but hadn't filed yet. They looked through the timeline I'd already begun documenting and took photos of the forged signatures with their phones. After 20 minutes of questions about my father's condition and my mother's attempts to change my name, they finally left with copies of everything. My phone buzzed at 7 that morning with an email from my former employer saying I needed to come in immediately to collect my personal belongings. The security guard met me at the front entrance and walked me through the lobby while my former coworkers pretended not to stare. He stood next to my desk watching while I packed my coffee mug, picture frames, and desk supplies into a cardboard box. People I'd worked with for 3 years wouldn't make eye contact as I carried the box past their cubicles. The HR representative was waiting in the conference room with separation paperwork and my final paycheck. She kept apologizing while explaining that 3 major clients had threatened to pull their contracts after my father's megaphone incident in the parking lot. The company couldn't afford to lose those accounts, so they had no choice but to let me go. She handed me a neutral reference letter that would only confirm my dates of employment and job title, nothing about performance or eligibility for rehire. I signed the papers acknowledging I'd received my belongings and wouldn't discuss company business or clients publicly. The security guard walked me back to my car and waited until I drove off the property. My phone rang that afternoon while I was updating my resume, and my landlord's name appeared on the screen. He explained that multiple neighbors had complained about the megaphone incident, and reporters had been knocking on doors asking questions about me. The building's management company was concerned about the negative attention affecting other tenants and property values. He offered to let me out of my lease early without penalty if I could be out within 30 days. I asked if this was really necessary, and he said the situation was making everyone uncomfortable, especially after seeing the funeral wreath with my picture. He'd already prepared the paperwork and would email it over for me to sign. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the day organizing everything that had happened since my brother's funeral 6 months ago. I printed every email, every text message, every social media post my family had made about me refusing to take Robert Jr. His name. The cease and desist letter from my father's first lawyer went in a clear plastic sleeve at the front. Photos of the fake business cards and the replaced nameplate from my office got their own section. I created tabs for different categories like workplace harassment, identity theft, and forged documents. Screenshots of the GoFundMe page claiming I was killing my father went into another section with all the comments calling me a monster. By evening, I had a 3-inch binder with color-coded tabs documenting every single incident in chronological order. The next morning, I drove to the police station with my binder and asked to file a formal report about the forged court documents. The desk sergeant looked skeptical when I started explaining about my father trying to force me to take my dead brother's name. I opened the binder and showed him the fake court order my father had brought to my workplace, claiming I'd legally changed my name. His expression changed when he saw the forged judicial seal and signature on official-looking paperwork. I flipped to the section with the spoofed emails my father had sent to clients from an address that looked like mine. The sergeant called over a detective who introduced himself as Dario McGill and asked me to follow him to an interview room. Detective McGill spent an hour going through my documentation while I explained the escalating harassment since my brother's funeral. He took the forged court order to make copies and said falsifying government documents was a serious federal crime. When I told him about my father's current condition from the illegal hormone treatments, he shook his head but said it didn't excuse the forgery. He warned me that family cases get complicated because prosecutors don't always want to press charges when relatives are involved. He gave me a case number and said he'd need to get statements from my former workplace about the incident with the fake documents. After leaving the police station, I drove straight to the legal aid office downtown, where I'd made an appointment the day before. Jesus Franco reviewed my binder while I sat across from his cluttered desk, explaining how my mother was now trying to forge power of attorney documents. He pulled out a checklist for filing a restraining order and started marking off the requirements I'd already met with my documentation. He explained I needed to show a pattern of ongoing harassment, which the binder clearly demonstrated over the past 6 months. He showed me the proper way to serve legal papers and gave me the name of a process server who handled difficult situations. We filled out the forms together, and he said I could file them at the courthouse that week. That evening, I was heating up leftover Chinese food when I heard footsteps in my apartment hallway. Through the peephole, I saw my mother standing there with a manila envelope, knocking and calling my name. She kept saying she'd gotten better paperwork from a real lawyer this time and just needed me to sign one form. I grabbed my phone and started recording video through the peephole as she waved the papers at my door. She tried the doorknob even though she knew I'd changed the locks weeks ago after she'd shown up uninvited. I called 911 and quietly explained that someone I had documented harassment against was trying to enter my apartment. The dispatcher said officers were on the way and to stay inside with the door locked. My mother was still talking through the door about how I was killing my father by being stubborn when the police arrived 10 minutes later. The officers took my mother's information while she kept insisting she had legal papers that gave her rights to my apartment. She pulled out the manila envelope and showed them the power of attorney forms with my forged signature already on half the pages. The younger officer looked at the documents and then at me standing in my doorway recording everything on my phone. He asked my mother to step away from the door while his partner ran her name through their system. She started crying about how I was killing my father by being stubborn and refusing to help with his medical care. The officers listened but kept her back from my door while they verified there were no existing court orders giving her access to my apartment. After 20 minutes, they told her she needed to leave the property and couldn't return without my permission. She left still clutching the forged papers and shouting that I'd regret not signing them properly. The next morning, I went straight to my bank and changed every single password on my accounts. The teller helped me set up 2-factor authentication on everything and suggested I also change my security questions to things my family wouldn't know. I spent 3 hours at different banks making sure my parents had no access to any of my money or credit cards. The fraud department at my main bank walked me through putting alerts on all my accounts that would text me instantly if anyone tried to access them. I drove to the Social Security office and filled out the paperwork to freeze my Social Security number completely. The agent there told me she'd seen family identity theft cases before, but never one where parents wanted to steal their kid's actual name instead of just their credit. She gave me a special PIN number I'd need to unfreeze it later, and made sure to note in my file that any changes needed to be done in person with photo ID. 3 days after the police removed my mother from my building, I went to the courthouse with my binder of evidence. The clerk at the filing window looked through my photos of the funeral wreath with my picture and the witness statements I'd gotten from coworkers. She stamped each page and gave me a case number for the temporary restraining order request. She scheduled a hearing for 2 weeks out and explained I'd need to serve my parents with the paperwork at least 5 days before the court date. I asked about process servers, and she gave me a list of people who did that kind of work professionally. I called Agustin Garza from the parking lot because his listing said he'd been serving papers for 20 years and specialized in difficult situations. He met me at a coffee shop that afternoon to look over the documents and get my parents' address. He told me he'd handled worse situations than angry parents and would make sure everything got served properly with proof for the court. He charged $200 but said it was worth it to have a professional handle hostile people who might react badly to legal papers. Meanwhile, I'd made an appointment with Zuleika Rivers, a therapist who specialized in family trauma and legal situations. Her office was in a quiet building downtown, and she had evening appointments, so I could go after looking for work. During our first session, I couldn't stop my hands from shaking while I explained everything that had happened since my brother died. She listened without judgment and helped me understand that my father's obsession wasn't really about honoring my brother, but about controlling me and the family narrative. She taught me breathing exercises to use when the anxiety got so bad I couldn't sleep at night. We made a plan for how to handle any contact from family members without getting pulled into arguments or defending myself constantly. I spent a whole day tracking down my 3 coworkers who'd witnessed my father's invasion of our office. They each wrote out exactly what they'd seen, describing the fake business cards he'd handed out and the nameplate he'd switched while I was at lunch. One coworker had actually kept one of the fake cards as evidence and stapled it to her statement. Another had taken photos of my dad in the parking lot with his megaphone and funeral wreath because she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The third coworker wrote about the spoofed emails our clients had received and how confused everyone was when they started calling asking for Robert Jr. 2 days later, the hospital called because I was still listed as my father's emergency contact on his admission paperwork. Gisela Cochran introduced herself as the social worker handling his case and said she needed to verify whether I actually had power of attorney. My mother had been showing documents with my signature, but something seemed off about them to the medical team. I scanned the forged papers my mother had brought to my apartment and emailed them to Gisela within an hour. I explained that I'd never signed anything and that my mother had forged my signature on those forms without my knowledge. Gisela called back after reviewing everything and said she'd make a note in my father's file that any documents with my signature needed to be verified directly with me by phone. She also said she'd alert security that my mother shouldn't be allowed to submit any more paperwork claiming to represent me. That same week, my mother started a text campaign to our extended family, claiming I was refusing to let them transfer Dad to a better hospital. She sent messages to aunts, uncles, and cousins, saying I was using my power of attorney to keep him in a bad facility out of spite. I screenshot every single message she sent, but didn't respond to any of them, following Zuleika's advice about not engaging with false accusations. Some relatives started calling me, but I let everything go to voicemail and saved the recordings where they called me selfish and heartless. My uncle left a message saying I was killing my father just like I'd killed my brother by not being a better son. I needed money fast since I'd been fired from my job, so I found a delivery company that paid cash daily. The manager didn't care about my family drama, as long as I showed up on time and got packages to the right addresses. The job paid less than my old position, but it kept me busy and away from my apartment where family members might show up. I worked 12-hour shifts delivering packages all over town and collected my cash at the end of each day. After 2 weeks of delivery work, I went back to see Jesus Franco at the legal aid office. He helped me draft cease and desist letters to family members who kept spreading the fake name change story on social media. We wrote 17 letters, one for each relative who'd attended that intervention my father had staged months ago. Jesus made sure each letter included specific examples of their false statements and warned them about defamation laws. We sent everything certified mail with return receipts so we'd have proof that each person received their letter and couldn't claim they didn't know to stop. The next morning, Detective McGill called while I was eating cereal and said he'd spent 3 hours interviewing people at my old workplace. He'd gotten statements from the security guard who escorted my dad out and 2 managers who witnessed the megaphone incident. The detective said the forged court order was enough for criminal charges, but the prosecutor would decide between forgery and identity theft. He told me to expect a call from the district attorney's office within 2 weeks about testifying if it went to trial. I thanked him and hung up, then started scrolling through apartment listings on my phone since my landlord had made it clear I needed to leave. Most places wanted first and last month's rent plus deposit, which meant I needed $3,000 I didn't have from my delivery job. I spent the whole morning calling about cheaper apartments and finally found one across town that was smaller, but only needed $500 down. The landlord Omar Dunn met me that afternoon at the building and walked me through a studio apartment half the size of my current place. He ran my credit while I stood there and said the numbers looked fine, even though I explained about losing my job. Omar handed me the keys right then and said he didn't care about family drama as long as rent came on the 1st of every month. I signed the lease in his office, and he gave me 2 weeks to move in, which meant I had to pack fast. That evening, while I was boxing up my kitchen stuff, my phone buzzed with notifications from the GoFundMe page my family had set up. Someone had posted new photos of me at the grocery store buying food, with captions saying I was living normally while my father died. The pictures showed me in the cereal aisle, at the deli counter, and loading bags into my car, which meant someone had followed me around the whole store. I screenshot everything and emailed it to Detective McGill with a note about being stalked, and he replied saying he'd add it to the file. 2 days later, Augustine called to say he'd successfully served my parents with the restraining order papers at their house. He said my mother screamed at him for 10 minutes while my father watched from his wheelchair, but he got the signatures he needed. Augustine's wife, Manuela, worked at the courthouse and had pulled all the records showing no legal name change had ever been filed in any court in the state. She found 17 different databases, and none of them had any record of me changing my name to Robert Jr., which proved my father's documents were completely fake. Augustine emailed me copies of everything from my records and said the judge would see this at the hearing in 2 weeks. That same night, my phone started blowing up with texts from a group message my mother had sent to 40 relatives. She claimed I was killing my father by blocking his medical care and preventing them from getting him proper treatment. The messages said I had power of attorney and was refusing to sign papers for a specialist, which was completely made up since I'd never had any legal authority over his care. I forwarded the entire thread to Jesus at the legal aid office, who added it to our growing file of harassment documentation. He said the texts would help prove a pattern of false statements and might support a defamation claim later if we needed it. Within hours, my cousins started sharing the messages on Facebook with added comments about how cruel I was being to a dying man. 2 of them stopped posting after they got the cease and desist letters Jesus had sent, but others doubled down and shared even more. My aunt created a whole Facebook page called Justice for Robert Jr., using photos from my brother's funeral and claiming I'd dishonored his memory. She posted 10 times a day with updates about my father's condition and how I was responsible for his suffering, gaining hundreds of followers who didn't even know our family. I had my therapy appointment with Zuleika that week and showed her all the messages and posts my family kept sending. She helped me write a simple 2-sentence response I could use every time someone contacted me about this mess. We practiced saying it out loud until it felt natural, and I could say it without getting emotional or adding extra words. The response was just 2 lines about not discussing the matter and directing communication to my attorney, which Zuleika said would protect me legally and emotionally. She also taught me breathing exercises to use when I felt overwhelmed by all the harassment, which was happening more each day. I decided to request my personnel file from my old job to see what they'd documented about my termination. The HR representative mailed it within 3 days, and I found notes about client complaints, but also years of positive performance reviews. She'd included a memo at the end confirming there was no misconduct, just family disruption beyond employees' control that made clients uncomfortable. The file showed I'd been a good employee until my father showed up with his fake documents and megaphone, which might help if I needed to explain the job loss to future employers. While I was reading through the file, I got an email from a journalist at the local paper asking for comment about the GoFundMe campaign. She'd seen the page claiming I was letting my father die and wanted to hear my side of the story for an article she was writing. I forwarded it to Jesus, who called me right away and said not to respond until after the restraining order hearing. He explained that anything I said could be twisted by my family's lawyer and used against me in court, so silence was better for now. That night around 10, my phone rang from a blocked number, and when I answered, there was just heavy breathing for 10 seconds. Then a voice I didn't recognize whispered that I'd killed them both, meaning my brother and father, before hanging up. I used my phone to record the voicemail greeting explaining the call and immediately filed another police report online, adding it to the harassment pattern. Detective McGill called the next morning saying he'd traced the number, but it was probably a burner phone that couldn't be tracked back to anyone specific. 3 days later, the moving truck showed up at 7 in the morning and I started loading boxes myself since hiring movers cost too much. Omar pulled up in his pickup truck and started grabbing the heavy stuff without me even asking for help. He mentioned while we carried my couch that his own family cut him off 10 years ago when he refused to give his brother money for drugs, so he understood how relatives could turn crazy over stupid things. We got everything loaded in 4 hours, and I handed him the keys to my old place before driving across town to the new apartment. The next morning, Detective McGill called to update me on the case and said the prosecutor decided to file charges for the forgery, but not the identity theft. He explained that since my dad didn't actually steal money or open credit cards in my name, they couldn't prove financial fraud, even though he'd tried to steal my actual identity. It wasn't everything I wanted, but at least the forgery charges meant something official was happening about the fake court documents. Jesus had me come to his office that afternoon to practice my testimony for the restraining order hearing coming up in 10 days. He played my parents' lawyer and kept interrupting me with questions about whether my dad was just grieving and didn't really mean to hurt me. I had to stay calm and stick to facts while he tried to make me look like the bad guy who wouldn't help his dying father. He warned me their lawyer would probably be even worse and might bring up my brother's death to make the judge feel sorry for my parents. 2 days after that session, I got a letter from the hospital ethics board about my complaint regarding my mother's forged documents. They'd investigated and found she'd tried to submit 3 different sets of paperwork, claiming to have power of attorney over me. The board had now flagged her in their system and would require photo ID plus verification directly from me for any documents she tried to submit about my care or my father's. They also sent a copy of their findings to the police to add to the forgery case. That same afternoon, one of my father's doctors called my cell phone asking about the no-contact boundaries since my dad kept demanding they call me about his condition. I explained the restraining order paperwork was filed and that any contact had to go through lawyers, not medical staff. The doctor said he understood and would note in the chart that I wasn't to be contacted about my father's care per legal proceedings. He also mentioned my father had been yelling at nurses about me stealing his legacy, which they were documenting as concerning behavior. I spent the next 2 nights building a simple website with just the basic facts about what happened. The timeline started with my brother's funeral and went through each incident with dates and evidence attached. I uploaded the forged court documents, the police reports, screenshots of the spoofed emails and official records from the courthouse proving no name change ever happened. Jesus reviewed it before I made it public to make sure nothing could be considered defamation since I only included documented facts with proof. The site went live on a Wednesday, and by Thursday morning my mother's attorney had already sent a letter threatening to sue me for elder abuse and defamation. The letter claimed I was lying about my parents to gain sympathy, and that posting the documents online was harassment of a dying man. Jesus responded within 2 hours with copies of all the forged documents and police reports, basically calling their bluff since everything on the website was true and documented. He also pointed out that threatening baseless lawsuits could be considered harassment under the restraining order we'd filed. Friday at my delivery job, I knocked on a door, and the woman who answered started recording me with her phone immediately. She said she recognized me from the Facebook page my aunt made and wanted proof I was working while my father died. I stayed professional, handed her the package, got her signature, and walked back to my truck without saying anything else. My manager backed me up when I reported it, saying I'd handled it right and that he'd reassign that address to another driver. Over the weekend, I submitted proof of impersonation to the email platforms my dad had used for the spoofed accounts. 3 of them removed the accounts within 48 hours and sent confirmation they'd been deleted for violating terms of service. The 4th platform refused, saying family disputes weren't their problem unless someone threatened violence, even though impersonation clearly violated their rules. Jesus said we'd include their refusal in our court filing to show the ongoing nature of the harassment. Monday morning finally came, and I put on my only suit for the restraining order hearing. The courthouse was packed, and I saw my parents for the first time in weeks. My dad in a wheelchair with an oxygen tank, and my mom holding his hand. Their lawyer stood up and immediately started talking about how my father was just a grieving man who'd lost his son and wanted to honor his memory. He said the name change request was just a father's desperate attempt to keep his dead son's memory alive, and that I was being cruel by refusing such a simple request. When my turn came, I testified about the forged documents, the workplace invasion, the spoofed emails, and the escalating harassment from family members. I showed the judge the funeral wreath with my picture, the fake business cards, and the power of attorney forms my mother had forged. Their lawyer kept objecting and saying grief made people do strange things, but the judge told him forgery was still illegal regardless of the emotional state behind it. The bailiff wheeled in a laptop on a cart and started setting up the video connection while the judge reviewed more papers. My dad's face filled the screen after a few minutes of technical problems, and he looked worse than when I'd visited him in the hospital. His skin had this yellow tint, and tubes ran from his nose while machines beeped in the background. The judge asked him to state his name for the record, and then got straight to the point about the forged court documents. My dad stared right at the camera and said yes, he'd made those papers, but I'd forced him to do it by refusing to honor my brother's memory. The judge asked him to repeat that he knowingly created false court documents, and my dad said it again, louder this time, adding that any good father would have done the same thing to preserve his legacy. The prosecutor was taking notes, so fast his pen was making scratching sounds across the paper. After about 20 minutes of questions, the judge turned off the video feed and spent another 10 minutes reading through all the evidence I'd submitted. She granted a 1-year protective order against my father with absolutely no contact allowed, not even through third parties. For my mother, she could only communicate with me through lawyers and couldn't come within 500 feet of my home or workplace. My mother started sobbing and telling the judge I was killing my father with stress, that his heart couldn't take this kind of rejection from his only living son. The judge looked at her over her glasses and reminded everyone in the courtroom that my father's medical condition came from illegal hormone treatments he'd given himself, not from my refusal to change my name. She added that attempting to reverse aging through black market drugs was a choice my father made, and the consequences were his responsibility alone. The gavel came down, and just like that, I had legal protection for the first time in months. That night, I actually slept 8 hours straight without waking up once to check the locks or wonder if my parents would show up. The protective order wasn't perfect, but having a judge officially say I was the victim felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. 2 days later, Detective Dario called to tell me the prosecutor had formally charged my father with forgery of government documents. They'd have to delay the actual proceedings until he was stable enough to appear in court, but the charges were filed and on record. The journalist who'd been following the case published her article that afternoon with quotes from the hearing and a timeline of everything that had happened. The comment section turned into a war zone with people calling me either a hero for standing up to abuse or a monster for abandoning sick parents. I stopped reading after the first 50 comments, but at least the real facts were out there for anyone who wanted to know the truth. My phone started ringing with job interview requests, and one manager specifically mentioned she'd read the article. She said she was impressed I was still showing up and trying to work through everything that was happening, and that kind of determination was exactly what her company needed. I had 3 interviews lined up by the end of the week. During my next session with Zuleika, we spent the whole hour working through the survivor's guilt that kept hitting me in waves. She helped me understand that my brother's death and my parents' reaction were 2 separate traumas that had gotten tangled together in my mind. We worked on ways to honor my brother's memory without letting my father's obsession poison those memories. She had me write a letter to my brother that I'd never send, just to get all the feelings out on paper. Jesus called me the next morning to say he'd filed paperwork with GoFundMe to investigate the campaign for fraud since it claimed I was preventing my father from getting medical care. Within 48 hours, they'd frozen all the funds pending investigation, which caused my aunt to send me 17 text messages calling me various names. My cousin started posting on social media that I was now stealing money from a dying man on top of everything else. But Jesus said having the funds frozen was a good sign that GoFundMe was taking the fraud claims seriously. A week after the court hearing, I walked into an office building for my 3rd interview and knew within 5 minutes this was where I wanted to work. The manager asked me straight out about my situation, saying she valued transparency and wanted to know if there would be ongoing drama. I explained the protective orders were in place, and I just wanted to work somewhere I could be productive and move forward. She offered me a data entry position on the spot, saying it paid a bit less than my old job, but had great health insurance, and they promoted from within. I accepted immediately, and felt something in my chest loosen for the first time since my brother's funeral. Starting fresh at a new job where people didn't know my whole story felt like exactly what I needed to begin putting my life back together. 3 days into the new job, Detective McGill called while I was on my lunch break. He told me my father had given a recorded interview from his hospital bed, thinking it would help his case by explaining why he forged those documents. Instead, he'd basically confessed to everything on tape, admitting he created fake court orders and spoofed emails because I wouldn't take my brother's name. The detective said it was the best evidence they could have asked for since my father described each crime in detail while the camera rolled. I thanked him and went back to my data entry, focusing on being the most reliable employee they'd ever hired. My coworkers didn't know anything about my family situation, and I kept it that way, eating lunch alone and leaving right at 5 every day. The normalcy of typing numbers into spreadsheets for 8 hours felt like medicine after months of chaos. 2 weeks later, my aunt showed up at my apartment with a letter from my mother, which violated the protective order since family members weren't allowed to deliver messages on her behalf. I photographed her through the peephole, called the police to document the violation, and filed a report the next morning. The judge called an emergency hearing where she warned my mother that the next violation would mean jail time, not just another warning. My mother sat there crying, but the judge wasn't having it, reminding her she'd already been given multiple chances to follow the court's orders. The prosecutor's office sent notice that the forgery trial was scheduled for 3 months out, assuming my father would be healthy enough to appear. His lawyer had already reached out requesting a plea deal, offering to have my father plead guilty in exchange for probation instead of prison time. Jesus and I spent an entire afternoon working on my victim impact statement, laying out exactly how the harassment had cost me my job, forced me to move, and destroyed my sense of safety. We stuck to facts and dollar amounts, calculating the exact financial damage from lost wages and moving expenses. The statement ran 4 pages of documented losses with receipts and pay stubs attached as evidence. GoFundMe finished their investigation and announced they were refunding all $200,000 to the donors since the campaign was based on false claims about me preventing medical care. My extended family went crazy on social media, posting that I'd now stolen money from a dying man on top of everything else. My cousins called me a thief and a murderer in the same posts, saying I'd taken food out of my father's mouth while he suffered on dialysis. I screenshot everything for my lawyer but didn't respond to any of it. The hospital called to say my father's health had improved enough for a transplant evaluation, but the committee rejected him as a candidate. They cited his history of illegal hormone treatments and non-compliance with medical advice as reasons he couldn't be trusted with a donated organ. He'd have to stay on dialysis 3 times a week for the rest of his life because of the damage he'd done trying to make himself younger. The prosecutor called Jesus to say they'd accept the plea deal, where my father would get 2 years probation and have to pay restitution for my lost wages and moving expenses. It wasn't jail time, but at least there would be some accountability and a felony on his record. The restitution came to $37,000, including the security deposits I'd lost and the difference in salary at my new job. At the sentencing hearing, my father appeared in a wheelchair looking 20 years older than his actual age from all the treatments. He told the judge he understood he'd gone too far, but still insisted I should have just taken the name to honor my brother. The judge cut him off and ordered him to get a psychiatric evaluation as part of his probation, saying his obsession with naming was clearly pathological. She also ordered him to have no contact with me for the duration of his probation, which meant 2 full years of peace. My mother had to wheel him out while he kept turning around to stare at me like I'd betrayed him all over again. That night, I updated the website I'd created with all the court documents, adding the final sentencing order and the GoFundMe refund announcement. Then I took the whole site down, deciding the truth was documented in official court records for anyone who really wanted to know. I didn't need to keep defending myself online anymore when the legal system had already validated everything I'd said. My new job was going well, and I'd even gotten a small raise after my first month for having the lowest error rate on the data entry team. Nobody there knew about my family drama, and I planned to keep it that way, just showing up on time and doing my work without any complications. The protective orders were in place, the criminal case was resolved, and I finally had some breathing room to figure out what came next without my family trying to force their delusions on me. 6 months passed with me rebuilding everything piece by piece. I'd moved into a one-bedroom apartment on the east side where nobody knew my family, signed a lease with Omar, who ran the building, and didn't ask questions beyond whether rent would arrive on time. The data entry job had turned into something steady with direct deposit every 2 weeks and health insurance that covered therapy sessions. My father was living in a care facility that specialized in dialysis patients, getting treatment 3 times a week while also seeing a psychiatrist the court had ordered. My mother had stopped showing up at my door after the judge warned her about jail time, though I still checked the peephole before opening it out of habit. The protective order meant 2 years without them trying to force their way back into my life. I met with Zuleika every Thursday at 4 o'clock in her office downtown, sitting in the same green chair while we worked through everything that had happened. She had me write lists of who I was before my brother died, filling notebooks with memories of playing basketball in high school and working at the movie theater during college. We talked about how I'd always been Josh who liked hiking and bad sci-fi movies, not just the son who wouldn't take his dead brother's name. I started texting old friends who'd reached out during the worst of it, meeting them for coffee and finding out their lives had kept moving while mine had stopped. One afternoon, the receptionist at work handed me an envelope from my father's attorney with the law firm's return address printed in the corner. Inside was a 2-page letter in my father's shaky handwriting, saying he understood now that grief had made him crazy, and he'd hurt me trying to bring back someone who was gone. He wrote that the psychiatrist was helping him accept that Robert Jr. was dead, and I was still alive, that forcing me to take the name wouldn't have brought his other son back. He was sorry for the forgeries and the harassment and the organ damage he'd caused himself trying to become younger. The therapist had him on medication now that helped with the obsessive thoughts about legacy and names. 2 weeks later, another letter arrived, this one from my mother admitting she'd enabled everything because she couldn't face losing both sons in different ways. She'd joined a grief support group at the church and was learning that helping my father's delusions had been her way of avoiding her own pain about Robert Jr. dying. She apologized for trying to forge my signature and said she understood if I never wanted to see them again. I brought both letters to Jesus at Legal Aid, asking him to write one response saying I needed time and distance, but maybe someday we could have contact with proper boundaries. He helped me draft 3 paragraphs that were firm but not cruel, explaining I was focused on rebuilding my life and would reach out if and when I felt ready. We sent it certified mail so there'd be proof it was delivered without me having to see them directly. My manager called me into her office 6 months after I'd started, sliding a paper across the desk that said I was promoted to team lead with a raise and better hours. She said she'd been watching how I handled the work without bringing drama to the office, showing up every day and getting things done despite everything I'd been through. The promotion meant training new people and running quality checks, more responsibility, but also more stability. I updated my LinkedIn without mentioning any of the family stuff, just listing the new title and responsibilities. A woman from the hiking group I'd joined asked if I wanted to get dinner after one of our Saturday walks, and I said yes, even though my hands were shaking. She knew the whole story because someone had sent her the news article, but she said everyone had family problems and mine were just more public than most. We went to a Thai place near the trail and talked about normal things like movies and whether the city should add more bike lanes. She didn't ask about my father's condition, or whether I regretted keeping my name, just treated me like a regular person who happened to have a complicated history. We kept it slow, getting coffee during the week and hiking on weekends, building something that felt healthy and separate from all the chaos. 1 year after everything started, I drove to the cemetery alone on a Tuesday morning when I knew it would be empty. I found Robert Jr., his headstone, and sat in the grass for an hour, finally able to think about him without my father's voice in my head, demanding I take his name. I told him about the new job and the apartment, and how I was sorry he'd gotten caught up in Dad's breakdown about legacy and names. The groundskeeper mowed around me without saying anything, while I sat there remembering my actual brother, not the symbol my father had turned him into. I was still Josh and always would be, exactly who I was supposed to be without taking anyone else's name or identity. Well, that's gonna do it for today. Thanks for letting me wonder through all these curious details with you. It's been really fun sharing this time together. Take care, and like the video, it helps more than you think.